Sometimes we assume people know as much as we do. So today we're going to go back to basics with our Property 101 episode.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're going back to basics with Property 101. You know, have you ever heard of the curse of knowledge? That's when somebody's an expert in a field. And even though we're teaching you guys, we still forget sometimes that you don't know everything we know. So we are today stepping back a bit and starting again from scratch. How's that?
It came out of a conversation that I had with a very good friend. And I was talking to him about he'd watched a property seminar online, and I thought, well, that's really interesting. You know, we've known each other for a long time. Why did you watch a property seminar online? And he said, well, actually, it was about the basics of buying property, not the process of buying property, which is, of course, what we teach you on Your First Home Buyer Guide, but the actual fundamental basics of property and leverage. And he said to me, I wish I knew about this sort of stuff earlier in my life. Now, he's bought properties, he's bought and sold properties. He's our age, late 40s, early 50s kind of thing. But he has known me for some time. And honestly, I was truly shocked. We talk about property a lot. It made me realise that sometimes I take for granted that people don't have the same base level of knowledge that I think they do.
Right.
But, we shouldn't take that for granted. So here we are. We're going to go right back to the basics. And if you have school-age kids or nieces or nephews who are interested in learning about the very basics of property, this is a really good place to start. This is not the process of buying, it's just the basic stuff.
The basics. All right, hit us with it. What's the first basic?
Look, at the heart of it, everybody has a basic need for shelter. That's a home to live in. Now, you can live in a house that you own, or you can live in a house that someone else owns. That's number one.
That is number one. All right. And that is, that's basic. Okay. So, and then someone else could be the government, could be an individual investor, could be your parents, could be all sorts of places. All right. So that's fundamentally housing is shelter. And if you're fortunate enough, you can actually go ahead and buy something. If you're not, or some people choose not to, they can rent. All right. So number two, I'll hit it. As a first home buyer, you can buy a property to live in, or you can buy an investment property that someone else lives in. So they're your options, right? If you've got the ability to purchase a property, you've got sort of two options.
Absolutely. And that's at the heart of it, really your two options. There are other things that you can invest in. This is not an investment advisory service. This is just Property 101. Okay.
Right.
Number three, you can borrow.
Let's complicate it, just because you know me, I like to complicate things. So as a home buyer, you can buy a property live in, or you can buy an investment property someone else lives in, or you could be a single person, buys a 2-bedroom apartment, kills 2 birds with one stone. You rent out your spare room and you live in the other one. You can do both.
Right. Just watch if you're using any incentives or grants that you're not breaking any of those rules. Again, we complicate it, but let's get back to the basics. Number three, you can borrow money to buy property. This is called a loan. Banks are one of the options, but there are also non-bank lenders.
That
So
is
we all
true.
know about ANZ and NAB and Commonwealth Bank and St. George. There are other non-bank lenders. So there's a variety of different places you can borrow money from.
Yeah, and in fact, even just looking at that, like you got the big four. So you said St. George, that's part of Westpac, ANZ, CBA, and NAB.
Well, now
Yeah.
ANZ and Suncorp are going to, anyway, there's
And what
lots
is
of lenders.
around Macquarie is being now sort of talked about as being, the big five now, big five, not just big four. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's been a proliferation of non-bank lenders and other second-tier lenders, and your broker would talk about that, but that's something that possibly a lot of people don't realise. So, 100%. So,
And some people don't borrow money from a bank. They might borrow money from a family. That's still borrowing to buy a property.
Yeah. Yes.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
Not many people are going to go down that path.
If you're really lucky, they give you the
can
money.
Borrow money to buy a property, And number 4, when you borrow money, the lender uses the property as what they call security. If you don't keep up your end of the deal, so you're part of the process, which is making repayments in accordance with your loan contract, then the lender can sell the property.
Yep. So this is called a recourse loan. And this is, just to complicate things again, in America, people might have heard of the subprime lending sort of fiasco that led to the GFC back in 2008. So ancient history, but some of you may remember it. And that's because in America, they don't have non-recourse lending, which means that anybody can go and hand in their keys.
If you can't afford it anymore, you can
it.
simply hand your keys back.
Not here.
You don't get the money back that you paid to them, but you don't have that agreement debt anymore. Yeah, that's not Australia, and that's why we didn't have the same sort of issues that we saw in the US.
It is very different. So yes, the property is security. All right, number 5.
Generally, lenders will not lend the full purchase price of the property. So you have to save some money to contribute to the purchase. This is called the deposit.
Yes. And it's, the deposit's actually a bit complicated because like in New South Wales, for example, you exchange contracts on a property or you go to auction and you exchange contracts when you buy and you have to pay a deposit. And that's the same word, but a different meaning. So that's it's a deposit in the sense of consideration, a contractual sense, to make sure that contract is binding. Like that's part of the 3 elements from memory. God, doing business contract law when I was at uni, that make a contract binding. However, the deposit that you save up that the bank wants to see is a completely different deposit and usually a different amount of money. So that makes things complicated again, doesn't it?
It does. Property 101. There are other costs that you also have to save for, such as stamp duty, legal fees, inspections, transfer fees. These are generally not covered by the lender and are in addition to your deposit.
Yes. And interestingly enough, when we've read those disaster stories that we see in the news and we do the episodes on those, the amount of people that have gone ahead and bought a property and got bought out because they didn't realise there were these other costs to take into consideration. So that is a 101 that catches out a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Some people talk about, I've got to save a 20% deposit. Now, actually, that's not a hard and fast rule. It's a way of avoiding, and we're not going to go into it here, but lender's mortgage insurance. We have done podcast episodes on lender's mortgage insurance, what it means, how it can be useful, what are the risks. But you don't always have to have 20%. Sometimes you can only have 5%. Mostly, though, people aim to have that 20%. Now,
actually, that's changing.
It has actually, now that you'd say that, yeah.
It is changing, and I literally read a report from Helio, who are one of the big LMI, lender's mortgage insurance companies in Australia, and the rate of people or the proportion of first-home buyers trying to save a 20% deposit in 2024 versus in 2019 has declined rapidly. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was
interesting.
Really, really obviously a big decline.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. Because when you think about it, in 2019 is when the 5% federal guarantee, which keeps changing its name. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's that the home loan deposit guarantee, where the government effectively becomes your insurer, your mortgage insurer. Now that came in 2019, so that's actually changed everybody's perception around the need to save 20%, and so it's had a marked impact. So that a lot of buyers, even if they're not trying to get that, they know that there are other ways to get a property without having to save 20%. So it's changed a lot in the last 5 years.
It's a really good point that you make there. And I think, certainly go back and listen to those podcasts and talk to your broker, a mortgage broker. We're getting down the path here from 101, but talking to a mortgage broker about all the options rather than going in with a closed mindset or any bias against any type of approach. Having an open mindset and going, okay, well, if I did this, what would it mean? Means that you get into a really powerful position.
Yeah.
Now, number seven, the difference between what the property's worth and the amount you owe the lender is called your equity.
Yeah. And it's funny because this is a term that people think, well, what does equity mean? Yeah. It's like,
and I think we use it quite free-flowingly because it's part of our lives. And it wasn't until talking to this friend, he said, I didn't really understand that whole equity thing previously. I was like, wow, okay. It's almost like a seminar that we need to do here, Veronica, where we do go into some of these basics because it's an important thing to understand.
Yes. Once you got equity, you can do so many other things, but that complicates things again. So we're not going there today because that's not what I want.
We'll get there eventually. It's further down.
Number 8.
Now, number 8, each lender, so the person that's going to lend money or organisation, they've got different policies about who they will lend money to and how much they will lend based on you and based on a number of other factors. Now, some of those factors are around your job, your income, the amount you've got saved, your credit history, your other debts, all sorts of different things. But no two lenders that I've come across have exactly the same lending policies. And that's why a broker can often get a different amount of money from one lender than they can from a different lender for the same person.
Yeah, it's amazing. But like, for example, rental income. So, this is not first home buyers, but if you are going to rentvest and you're factoring in rental income into your mortgage calculations, some banks will accept that to a different percentage than others. It's quite fascinating. And your bonuses, some banks will accept all your bonus and others won't. And so that's
overtime can be treated differently.
Yeah. And the policies can change. So the last time you borrowed with this bank, that's what their policies were. The next time we go to borrow with them, and they're completely different. So, so that's something that surprised me. That's for sure. When I sort of got to have a bit of an insight into that. So most buyers wouldn't think that. They just think you borrow the same amount of money for everyone.
Go to the bank, go to the lender, get the same. No, not at all. Now, also, number 9, each lender has different policies about how much they'll lend for different types of properties and the location of the property. So it's not just about you, it's about, remember we use the word security, it's about the security, which is the property that you're purchasing as well.
To give you an example, we come across it not often, but enough. In Sydney, there's two things that we notice. There's one thing called limited title, and that's because I'm in a very old area that's got lots of Victorian terraces, and some of those old houses have not got an up-to-date title, right? And so some banks don't like that, and others don't blink an eyelid. But honestly, it never used to be an issue. It's only in recent years it's even become an issue with some banks.
That's right.
So for years, it's been not a problem.
Yeah.
Another one is company title apartments. It's another one. And another one is banks that will have too many owners in one building that are on their books, and they go, I don't really want any more apartments in that building. That's too much a risk for us. So they just say, no more lending in that building. So that address a black band. But it could change, because a few of them sell or they refinance, and all of a sudden that bank will lend in that building again.
Yeah. The other thing could be the size. Some banks won't lend under 50 square metres for an apartment. Some banks have policies that it can't be a studio, it has to be a separate bedroom. Some banks have policies about what kitchen facilities need to be in place. So it can't just be a bed sit, it's got to be a full kitchen. So really important to understand these things that the bank considers you and it considers your security as well.
Yeah.
Now, number 10. Now, this is really important because there's no set price for property. The sale price of each property is established by the buyer. That's how much they want to pay. And the seller, how much they're willing to accept. Now, there's a formal way of saying what market value is, but that's the essence of it. What is a willing buyer and a willing seller prepared to come to an agreement on when neither of them are under duress? That's what a property is worth. That's hard to work out, but there is a way of doing it.
So, except for off the plan, that's a little bit different, right? It's like a recommended retail price for property.
Well, it's a developer set price.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, there is no such thing outside of that. Outside of that, in the normal established market, which is the vast majority of property that comes onto the market, no recommended retail price. So that is, it's sort of an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah.
All right,
sorry, Veronica.
You hit us with number 11.
Number 11 in our 20 Property 101s. The choice of which property you purchase has the biggest impact on whether the value increases or decreases. And this is what you and I call like quality asset selection.
Yep. It's the absolute cherry on top, this stuff. And this is what we do teach you in your first home buyer guide, is these principles around asset selection, A grade property versus B and C, and the performance of A grade property over time absolutely does so much better than B and C grade property, particularly C grade property.
Okay, so Veronica, the next thing, number 12 on our Property 101 list is what you might have heard but really don't know how, and you might have learnt about it at school but not really know how it applies to property, and that's compound growth.
So compound growth, it's one of the isn't this the eighth wonder of the world or something? It's just amazing. It's so fascinating. So what compound growth is that every year that you have an increase in value, then the following year another increase in value. It's always a percentage of the starting point, right? So year one, at the beginning of the year, it's worth a certain amount of money. By the end of the year, it's worth something else, hopefully more, sometimes less, but usually more, right? And so say that's 10% more, right? So you've gone from being worth $1 million to being $1.1 million. And that's your growth that year of $100,000. The following year, the growth is a percentage of that new total.
New total.
Right? So
not the original total.
So the percentage is of your 1.1 million, not your 1 million, And so this keeps going. And I mean, it doesn't always go at 10%.
Easy way to give some examples.
So what I liken it to say, it's like a snowball, right? You put a little tiny snowball at the top of the mountain and it rolls down a hill, and as it gets bigger and bigger, it gathers more snow and it gets bigger and it gets bigger faster. So the bigger it is, the longer you've had the property, the better it performs, the more you're going to make in time. And this is the wonder of compounding. And it's one of the reasons why, if you can get in the property market earlier, generally speaking, it's a good idea, because the longer you're in the market, the better off you are. So,
Absolutely.
But it's a magical, wonderful thing. And when you see it in the rear vision mirror, when you know that you've been investing and doing all these things over many, many years as we have, you go, oh, wow, that's impressive.
Compound growth.
Compound growth.
Really quite remarkable. And you do get it, on your savings as well. Interest compounds on top of the money that's in there, as long as you leave it in there. But compound growth is a really good one to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And number 13 is...
can I just add in one thing there? And this is probably the other thing that's a 101. Because when you borrow money for property, you are actually compounding growth on money that you've borrowed, not just your deposit that you've saved up. And so this is one of the big wonders of property as an investment tool. And this is why people like to invest in property, because you can borrow so much, which means that your snowball is bigger. Yes, you borrowed part of that snowball, but it's bigger. And so it's going to grow faster than if you just used cash and bought something tiny in a tiny little outback town for the deposit money, as opposed to into a capital city. Anyway, that's a slightly skewy example. But the simple fact is that the fact you can borrow money, while scary, if you buy a good asset, actually is a really good thing, and there's a real opportunity to make money over time.
Yeah. Now, this flows on to number 13, which is a property's value can go up and it can go down. Now, this is one of the risks of owning property.
Yeah.
Property 101, there are risks associated with owning property.
And you know that, and it's funny because over time, as I just mentioned, generally speaking, the value of property goes up. And I say generally speaking because if you look at all the data in Australia, and you look at the charts, you can see over years, might be some little bad years, but generally speaking, the trend is up. However, you're not buying a piece of the share of the entire Australian property market. You're buying one property. And some individual properties end up losing money whilst everybody else is making money. And that's the bit that we want to save you from. And that's the bit that most people don't get.
The asset selection and the process. Now, number 14,
Exactly.
If the value goes up, it's called capital growth.
Yeah.
Number 15, if the value goes down, it's called negative growth.
Which sort of is like, it's sort of mutually exclusive, isn't it? Like it's negative growth. It's growing negatively. Is it correct?
Yeah, well,
Degrowth. It's like degrowth.
devalued. But it is negative growth.
Negative growth.
As opposed
Not
to the
positive growth.
which comes from, the right asset selection in the right location. Now, number 16, if the value goes up, the difference between what you owe the lender and your loan, well, that is your loan balance, and the new value is your equity.
Yeah.
Now, you might have heard of this and wondered, well, what is equity?
So the way in which you get equity in a property is, well, there's three ways, right? The first way is you pay down the debt, right? So you owe more. The bank owes.
You owe the bank less.
Thank you very much. You got that. The second way is if you can actually manufacture equity or you can renovate that property and make it worth more money. And the third way is when it actually goes up because the market's rising and that's a good asset and it's doing really well. And that's good capital growth, which is equity again, which we love.
We do. Number 17, on the other hand, is if the value goes down and you owe the lender more than the property is worth, it's called negative equity.
Which is painful and to be avoided.
Yeah, and that's a really poor asset selection.
Yeah.
Number 18.
Although sometimes, let's just be, generally speaking, it's poor asset selection. But if anyone was around in the property space in 2021, they realised how fast prices rose. They massively rose. And if you happen to buy, unfortunate to buy at the very peak of the market, and then when it came off the boil again the following year.
Particularly in Sydney, yep.
You could, and Brisbane's hot at the moment, like it could happen at some point, comes off the boil, prices do reset, right? And for a little bit of time, some people could end up in negative equity. Doesn't mean they've got a bad asset, it's just a short-term thing and they've got to ride that out because that's just the market forces at play.
It can be painful, but if you're in it for the long term, we'll talk about long-term and short-term shortly.
Yeah.
Now, number 18, you can use the equity in your property to borrow more money to purchase another property. This is called leverage. This is a fundamental part of property investment.
Yep.
But you can use your existing or your personal property, the home that you live in, you can use it to leverage into another property.
So the basic premise is there. You once you've started your first deposit on a property and then you build equity in that property, you hopefully will never have to save up for another deposit ever again. That's the ideal.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Number 19. Yeah, people build their property portfolios, you might have heard that word, by using the equity in the properties they own as the deposit on the next purchase, which is what Veronica just explained, which is, saving up for that first deposit is often the hardest bit, and then being able to use the positive growth or the capital growth in the property to get equity out of the existing property can be used as a deposit on another property.
Yep. And I'm just going to chuck something in there as a little bit of a warning because it is very, very, very powerful and it is used by a lot of spruikers who would try to get you to part with that hard-earned equity to buy a crappy little investment because in our hearts as Australians, we do value property as investing and we really, ideally all want to become, actually it's not true that we all want to become landlords, but a lot of us do want to become landlords. And so a lot of spruikers tap into that sort of innate desire within us by saying, now you've got this equity, look what you can use it to buy. So be very, very careful that, yes, you have that once you have built that equity, but how you use that, you've got to be just as careful as if you'd saved that money.
Absolutely. Number 20, which is our third last, some people buy and sell in less than 5 years. This is considered a short-term hold.
Mm-hmm.
But owning a property for more than 10 years is generally considered a long-term hold. And if you're looking for compound growth, often that period of time is where you're really starting to see some magic.
100%. In fact, say, for example, your property has a potential to double every 10 years, right? That's a 7.2% annual compound growth that gets it to doubling every 10 years. And let me tell you, no market, no property will actually ever have the same amount of growth every year. It doesn't happen that way. This is average, right? So if it has averaged out at 7.2% annual growth compounded, it will double in value after 10 years. So think about this. You buy a property for $500,000, 10 years later, it's worth $1 million, right? So then you have it for another 10 years. At the end of 20 years, you've owned it now, it's worth $2 million, right? After the 30 years, it's worth $4 million. So you, in your first 10 years of owning that, you made $500,000. Your second 10 years, you made $1 million. And the third 10 years, you made $2 million. That's compounding. And that's the benefit of a long-term hold.
Yeah, and that's not financial advice from Veronica or I. That's just using an example of the compounding nature. We've got dogs going everywhere today. Hope you're enjoying our homes.
Dogs going crazy. Anyway.
Now, our final one is that long-term, people can use property as a way to build wealth. And for some people, it is part of their retirement planning. So it's not just their home. They're actually building for their future using property as one of the asset classes to achieve that long-term goal of retirement.
Yes, in this country, we have this amazing superannuation setup too, which is about retirement planning. But a lot of people want to feel like they've got some sort of control over it themselves. And we certainly have a bit of a love affair with property in this country. In fact, it's one of the biggest aspects of our economy. And so, and the bottom line is, so the earlier you can start, the better off you are. That's all I can say when it comes to property, because it's not known as what's called an income asset. It's known as a growth asset. So therefore, your runway to owning that property and your retirement, the longer that runway is, and you made good asset selection decisions, right, then your retirement will be a little bit better than if you did.
Lovely. Now, that was Property 101. Next week, we're going to go back to basics with Property Investment 101. Now, again, we're not giving financial advice, we're not giving mortgage advice. What we want to give you is the basics of some of the words that you will hear and what they actually mean, so that you're really well armed to have good quality conversations with people.
Absolutely. Quick note, you might think that we cover everything that you need to know on these podcasts. A word of warning, we don't. We just scratch the surface here. If you really want to be an educated first-home buyer, you need to learn all the steps in the right order and how to do everything in the right order. And I would just add it too, we have created a little Facebook group. So if anybody wants to join, what are we called? Look in the show notes anyway for the link. I think it's called Your First Home Buyer Guide Australia. I can't remember. It's what Facebook group with the longest name.
I think it is actually. Now, our First Home Buyer Guide, or your First Home Buyer Guide course, only costs $990, and you get direct access to us to help guide you through your negotiations. Now, I sat with 2 people in Campfire today. One had just purchased her property after having 3 campfires with us, and the other one had just missed out on an auction, but he was ready to roll with the next one. You can also share a link with any property that you're thinking of buying, and we can help you work through whether it's A, B, or C grade or an absolute no-go zone. Trust me, you'll buy better with our guidance, and you'll overpay by a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing.
Yes, you will.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out Your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you've found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.